All right. So here we got chapter 1. And chapter 1 is, just like any chapter 1 in any textbook. It's going to be a great kind of introduction to what's going on in the class for the semester. There are kind of two major things here. Okay, there are kind of two major things here. And when I say two major things, two big concepts. And with those big concepts here in this case, they would make great short answer questions. The characteristics of life would be something that I would pay attention to, okay? And the process of science, the scientific method, okay? Those are two things that you should be able to discuss on an exam, okay? So they would make good short answer questions, all right? So make sure you know those things forwards and backwards. Everything else, I mean, it's just some great multiple choice type questions or, fill in the blank type questions. Excuse me, I got some allergies today. Or something along those lines, guys. So with that said, let's jump into it here, okay? Biology, scientific study of life, okay? It is, like I said last week, biology is the basics of everything. And even though most of you may not be biology majors at all, biology helps you to, it's a system, okay? And everything builds upon this system here, all right? And understanding these basic building blocks of life helps you to make life choices later on, choices about medications, voting on different referendums for different ways to, handle new buildings. We'll talk about biodiversity at the, we'll hint at it today, and then, we'll talk about it, later when we start talking about genetics and when we start talking about biomes and whatnot at the very end of the semester. So, understanding what happens with new construction in an undeveloped, region of the county, and what that does just by changing the landscape, man, going in there and changing the landscape, what that does to it and all the ramifications that come from it. Understanding all that gives you just a lot more knowledge that you can vote on things, give an opinion on things, and just understand what people are discussing and talk about. So that's what I really want you to get out of this class. Plus for those that are going on in biology, in the medical field, I mean, there is going to be so much more that we build on from here on out. In 109, a good chunk of the class harkens back to what we're going to be talking about all semester long here. So, this is the basic building block for a lot of scientific classes. There's a ton of diversity, as you know, okay? But within all of that diversity, they all share these 6 basic characteristics from all the way from bacteria all the way up to us, from the very simple to the most complex things that we have going on this planet, all right? All of them share 6 characteristics. Hell, even if it's a plant, okay? They all share 6 basic characteristics. We're going to talk about them. You should be able to list them all out, and you should be able to briefly describe them on an exam for me. 6 things. The first one here. Living things are organized, okay? Everything is organized. Look at the human body. It is organized, okay? We have cells, we have tissues, we have organs, we have organ systems, we have the organism. And all of those levels of organization get more and more and more complex. More moving parts, more complexity associated with them. And really for us, we're going to start at the atom level. If I go forward a page here, this is where we're going to start our journey here in this class, all right? We're going to look at atoms and molecules and how these things interact to form molecules, how these atoms interact to form molecules, and how the various different molecules interact together to get us cellular structure. Okay, The cell is the basic unit of structure and function of all living cells. Okay? If you destroy a cell, you destroy the functionality of a tissue. Okay? So if I lose a liver cell, the function of my liver diminishes a little bit. If I lose a significant chunk of those liver cells, then I have a dramatic decline and disease sets in. Okay? And that's with us because we're multicellular creatures. But what about bacteria, unicellular stuff? Same thing, okay? You destroy the cell, you destroy the bacteria, okay? And like I said, each level of organization, every time you go up and up a level of organization, it just gets more and more and more complex. With that complexity arises these emergent properties. These are properties that are present only at that level. A cell is just a cell, okay? A cell wants to live, a cell wants to stay alive, okay? It has some functions that go on inside of it, all right? But when I get a group of cells working for a common goal, now I have a tissue, and that has a hell of a lot more properties associated with it than an individual cell, okay? And so we see this kind of constant complexity and functionality that increases with each new level. And that's what we see right here, all right? This has a certain amount of function, but you get it to interact that oxygen with a hydrogen atom and another hydrogen atom, and now we have a molecule of water. And that's much different than just two individual, okay? Just two individual atoms of hydrogen and oxygen. Then we get molecules. Molecules come together and they give us cells. Again, the basic structural functional unit of all living things, okay? These cells have different emergent properties. A nerve cell, okay, which helps to conduct electricity from your brain down to your fingers and toes to everywhere, has much more different type of properties than a muscle cell. It's just going to be a cell that is going to cause movement, cause contraction, okay, which is going to be different from a pancreatic cell, which is going to secrete hormones or digestive enzymes. So each cell has its own unique functions, and those are the emergent properties for all of those individual cells. As you go up here, we get more and more complex, a group of cells working for a common goal, that's tissues, okay? We have a group of tissues working for a common goal, that's going to be an organ. And then we have all of these various organs working for a common goal, an organ system. And I believe all of this is written out on a few slides here from now, okay? And then all of these organ systems work together, and that gets you. And this is my world right here. This is human anatomy, human physiology, nutrition. This is what I deal with, okay? Every single day, okay? So for me, I love this organization, and I see this organization, and I see these emergent properties show up with the increase in complexity that we see here, okay? As we get further along, we have a group of organisms in a specific region. That's going to be called a population, okay? This is some of the stuff we're going to be looking at the very end of the semester, okay? This is some of the stuff we're looking at the very beginning of the semester, okay? This is the start of class. Okay? And this is the end of it. I'm getting so good at writing with a mouse. All right. This stuff here, this is another class. Okay. So we're going to look at all of this stuff here and, through the first basic month or so of class. We're going to look at this at the very, back end of class, last 2 or 3 weeks. Okay. And we'll dive into, how this cell is going to divide, because that's going to be a property that you can probably imagine that we need to have. So we'll look at how that does it. So we'll get into the thick of, we'll expound upon all of these emergent properties, basically. Community, ecosystem, biosphere. So we're going to talk about all these and how man can influence communities and influence ecosystems, which can ultimately influence the biosphere. So, these all, and these are all the words that I've kind of been talking about here. Okay. So, these all make, being able to, write some of this out, obviously, as I said, short answer question, but again, these are going to be multiple choice type questions as well. Okay. This is where it begins. Atoms combine to form molecules. They'll form bigger things called macromolecules and make what we have, the cells, and we'll look at the cell and all the little fun stuff inside of it. Tissues, organs, organ systems, populations, ecosystem, biosphere. Again, these make great multiple choice type questions. Obviously, you probably use maybe a few of these when you talk about the first emergent property, living things are organized. All right. Number 2 thing. Life requires stuff. Life requires materials, and life requires energy. You need energy to do things. What kind of things? Make stuff. Just to sit there like a bump on the log right now, listening, kind of listening to me, watching TV. That requires energy to do stuff. There are a number of processes going on inside your body right now that maintain the status quo. That is energy being used. Okay. So we got all this energy, and we'll look at how. Okay. We'll talk about metabolism, and we'll see how the body makes energy later on in the semester. But we also need materials. We need raw materials inside, bringing it in to make things, to do stuff. Okay. And where do we get those materials? Well, your diet. Okay. Your diet. That's the food you eat. Metabolism is the sum of all chemical reactions that occur within a cell. And we'll be looking at this later on in the semester, like I said. Where does this energy come from? Well, it all starts with the sun. Okay, that's number 1. All right. Without the sun, there would not be any life. Okay. We can't just go outside and soak up some sun rays and be full. That would be fantastic. But we can't do that, obviously. Okay. So it all starts with the sun. That's the ultimate source of all energy. Okay. Plants use that, they capture that, and they convert that sun into energy to make things. So plants are using that sun to make carbohydrates, to do stuff inside of it. Okay. And you know that process, and that's called photosynthesis. Okay. Plants, algae, some other organisms, cyanobacteria, okay, some various other animals as well. Basic bacteria, archaea. All of these organisms can capture that solar rays and convert it into usable energy. Then we have animals that eat the plants. And then they get materials and they get energy. And then we eat those creatures that eat the plants, and, yada, 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 we're at the top of the food chain. And that's what I'm trying to show you here. Okay. Sun is the ultimate power source. Okay. Different things. We have the grasses here. We have plants. They are taking that and making it usable energy. Okay. They're making carbohydrates, and we'll look at photosynthesis later on in the semester, and we will see how that happens. I know you're all excited for that. Consumers consume the plants. Okay. These guys get eaten by the bigger guys, and we eat these guys, and we get our energy from them. Okay? And then the great thing about it, here, they decompose and they add back to the ecosystem, to the biosphere. And that gives nutrients for these plants to grow, plus a little sunlight, yada, 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 they get bigger. And that's what I'm trying to sum up here in this slide, on slide 13, okay? Ecosystems are characterized by this chemical cycling, and we'll hint at some of these at the very end of the semester, because these chemical cycles are important for the survivability of a biosphere, okay? If we don't have this cycling going on properly, that ecosystem is going to falter, okay? And it's not going to be as a productive of an ecosystem, all right? And if an ecosystem isn't doing what it's supposed to do, the whole biome, the planet, starts to diminish because of that. I just made reference to it a second ago in my discussion of number 2, but we have to maintain the status quo, okay? And that's what homeostasis is. It's just, we have a boundary through which normal function can occur, okay? You get too little, you get too much. Outside of that boundary, that homeostasis, that normal functioning area, and stuff doesn't function very well, okay? Take the pH of the blood, okay? pH of the blood has to be, slightly alkaline, okay, which is a little above neutral, okay? You get too acidic or too more alkaline, too more basic, and now stuff doesn't function properly, okay? Oxygen doesn't bind to the red blood cells as effectively, okay? You may not be able to bind with carbon dioxide as effectively either. So you're not getting oxygen into the various different tissues that need it to make energy and do work. Conversely as well, if I can't dump off CO2, well then I get waste products accumulating within the blood, and the body doesn't like that either. So we have these various different feedback systems, and they're mostly negative feedback systems, okay, that help to maintain the status quo within inside of us, which the fancy word for that is homeostasis. Living things respond to stimuli. If we don't respond to stimuli, we can't interact with the environment. And if we can't interact with the environment, our surroundings, we die, okay? An example, okay? We're out in the wild, okay? We are early man. And being able to see something kind of move out the corner of your eye, you're all of a sudden you're looking over there, you're like, oh crap, there's like a tiger or something, okay? Now I'm responding to that stimuli. I think that's a tiger over there. I'm gonna go this way and I'm gonna go really fast and I'm gonna get up that damn tree, okay? Because I don't want the tiger to get me. That is responding to the stimuli. On a much more basic level, bacteria, okay? They don't have eyes, right? But they have various different receptors to where they can detect chemicals. All of a sudden, a chemical gets into the water medium that they're living within, and they can sense that, and they can move away from that, okay? Some bacteria can't, all right? But they have adaptations on the surrounding surface of them that allow them to potentially survive an adverse effect, okay? It's called a glycocalyx, and we'll talk about that plasma membrane when we talk about the cell later in the semester here as well. Living things reproduce. Living things develop. If we can't reproduce and pass our genetics on to the next generation, what's the point? Okay. If we can't develop to be able to survive, to be able to learn, to be able to find a mate, to pass that on, to rear that young so they survive, so the genes can continue to pass on, life won't exist, right? Some of the basic functions inside the human brain: look for water, look for food, and look for sex. Okay, the water drive, the hunger drive, and the sex drive. Those are the three basic functions in the basic, most rudimentary parts of our brain that drive us to find those things. Okay, because those are characteristics. That's how we're here from everything starting so many moons ago. The type of reproduction will vary. And as you might have guessed it, we're going to talk about that. Okay, we'll talk about how cells reproduce. Okay, we'll talk about fission for bacteria. We'll talk about mitosis for cells within us. Okay, and we'll look at plants as well. But I'm more concerned about us. But we'll talk about it. Look at meiosis. Meiosis is how our sex cells divide. Okay, how they reproduce. And that's the egg and the sperm, if you didn't know. What's being passed on? It's those genes. Okay, that's our genetic info. That's how the next generation is made. And we'll look at this process of how the cell actually copies the DNA, okay? How it reads the DNA to make things, all right? Because it's one thing to just copy it, but we need to be able to read that information and then make proteins from it. And that's what reading that genetic code does, okay? Reading that genetic code allows us to make the proteins that we need to build things, to build the brain, the heart, structures inside of us in utero, to continue to make these things properly. If I misread that, it may not do anything. But if I misread that and something's removed from that genetic code for some reason because there was a misread, well, now I have a loss of function. Okay? And that could mean the development of cancer. That could mean the development of a disease. Okay? Trisomy 21 is when that copying of that genetic material doesn't go as planned. And there's an extra little piece in there because there was a misread during the cell cycle. Okay? And we'll look at some of that and we'll hint at just how some of that happens. And we'll look later on the semester how into the weeds of how this DNA does get copied. And we look at how viruses function. We're going to look at how viruses function just a little bit here, considering what's going on right now in the world. Understanding how viruses do that and why they're so highly adaptable and why it takes time to figure out this stuff, okay? We can speed things up a little bit within a lab, but getting data over a long period of time, that's what science thrives on, and trying to figure out, this COVID thing, we love our information right very now. And if I gotta wait, I gotta read something it's gonna take, 5 minutes? Oh my gosh, I can't do that. It's gonna take forever, okay? Sounds like my kids, all right? We needed everything right then and now. With this COVID thing, we all want information, but it takes time. And that's what stinks with our society right now because of that. The last thing here, adapt. Living things have adaptations, okay? This is what drives evolution, is these modifications, okay? An adaptation is any modification that allows an organism to be better able to function within an environment. Now, it can be a positive adaptation, like this is insinuating? I mean, it could be a negative adaptation. It could be an adaptation that does not give you an advantage. It may give you a disadvantage, okay, in certain situations. Look at sickle cell. Sickle cell is an adaptation, okay? There's a mutation that has occurred in the reading of the genetic information there to make a red blood cell. Okay, and so instead of nice and circular, it's shaped like a sickle, like that. Okay, like that. Let me draw it. I don't know if you can see my. Instead of being round, it is sickle shaped. Okay, sickle shaped. It's an adaptation. Okay, if I'm somewhere in the Mediterranean or Africa, where malaria is endemic to, this adaptation allows me to survive, okay? This misshape doesn't allow that malaria to get inside the red blood cells and reproduce and destroy the red blood cells and ultimately can destroy the host. But if I'm outside of that region where I don't have malaria, this adaptation can be negative and may not allow me to, depending on the severity of it, may not allow me to better function in that environment. So adaptation can be both positive and negative. But again, this is what drives evolutionary change, are these adaptations. And we'll look at how we read that genetic code and how there's an interesting video that we'll show later on as well that kind of looks at how we get all of this dramatic variation in body shape and body structure. And the genome really, isn't a whole heck of a lot of difference between a lot of us. So it's fascinating to look at how these adaptations, how these changes have driven the creation of new species and whatnot, or the splitting of species. Okay, so evolutionary change is driven by these adaptations, and we'll talk about that obviously towards the end of the semester as well. And that's a theory of evolution. Okay, it gives us reasons, explains the diversity of life, the unity of life. Okay, and we'll dive into this a lot more. Charles Darwin's a dude that kind of like the quote unquote founder of this evolutionary mechanism that we'll talk about called natural selection later on in the semester. Okay, and this is just an example here. Got a deer, loves to eat plants, right? Well, do you want to eat a plant that's nice and smooth, or do you want to eat, a leaf that has a lot of hairs on it? Of course, you don't want to eat hairs. Deer don't want to eat a hairy leaf either. Okay, but if this deer is constantly plucking off those leaves, okay, those smooth leaves with no hairs on it, because it likes those better, there's no leaves on the tree, or there's a lot fewer leaves on the tree. And if there's a lot fewer leaves on the tree can't make as much energy, can't get bigger, okay, can't grow. So we have an adaptation here. There was a mutation. One thing changed. All of a sudden it became hairy. It's disturbing. Okay. Over time, that deer keeps eating more and more of those hairless leaves. And this adaptation, all of a sudden, these guys start to increase in numbers. And these guys are the ones that are dividing. Okay. And this is what gives that plant that ability to survive. Now the deer ain't gonna eat me. The deer don't want to eat no hairy leaf. Blah, disturbing to think about. Hairy leaves. Okay. After generation after generation after generation, more and more of those trees are going to have those hairy leaves. And so the deer will hopefully migrate on and find another tree to eat on without hairless leaves. Well, Some terms here that you should kind of be aware of. I'm not big on, and with what we're going to be doing basically, and without the in lab portion here, we're not going to get into this a huge heck of a lot this semester, but there's a couple branches of science here. There are many of them, but one is called taxonomy, and you should be able to just kind of be able to tell me what it is, multiple choice, short answer, like fill in the blank type of question, potentially. But this taxonomy is just a discipline that identifies and names things, classifies things, okay? There are a certain number of rules. We're not going to get into them, all right? And that's what helps us to define, our three major domains and the several kingdoms that we have within the eukaryotic organisms here. So that's taxonomy. Systematics looks at it from an evolutionary standpoint, okay? Understanding how things are related to one another. And we'll look at some of these systematics later on when we talk about evolutionary changes, both on the small individual level and the whole speciation level of it as well, and the emergence of a new species. So we'll look at those. We'll look at some systematic stuff later in the semester, but understanding what these terms mean, again, they make a good, multiple choice type question, or they make a fantastic, fill in the blank type of question. There are a number of very different classifications that we use to clump groups together. Domains are really huge, okay? It would be like a big umbrella, covers everything. And then there's three major domains, and you're going to probably need to know those, and I think there are a few slides from now, so we'll go over those briefly, because we'll be talking about those. You talk a little bit about some of those throughout the semester here when we look at some of the stuff as we get further down in evolutionary changes, and Labster talks about certain things. So kind of understanding what some of these major domains are, these three major domains are, and some of the genus species concepts here. It's important to kind of know those. Okay, so this is the most inclusive, domains. A step down from that is kingdom. So domain, kingdom, and then ultimately we get down to genus and species. Okay, most inclusive, least inclusive. Okay, Homo sapien. Okay, Homo man. That's Homo sapiens are pretty inclusive group. Okay, Homo sapiens are not lions, sharks. Okay. What are the three domains? Here are the three domains. Okay. Domain Archaea, bacteria, and eukarya. Prokaryotes and eukaryotic organisms. All right, we're going to be looking at these guys randomly throughout, but we're really going to be looking at some of the differences when we start to look at cells. Chapter 3, I think, I can't remember. 3, 4, and 5. We start looking at cells, and we start looking at the plasma membrane of them. And as we start to look at how these things divide, you'll really see, we'll be talking about prokaryotic organisms and eukaryotic organisms. These are unicellular. Okay, these are unicellular. Eukaryotic, there are a couple very rudimentary unicellular archaea, but for the most part, guys, they are multicellular. Okay. So let's just remember that.
Oh, it's me. Don't go outside.
This is us, okay? We're eukaryotic organisms. We have a membrane-bound nucleus. We have membrane-bound organelles, okay? We have some unique structures that prokaryotic organisms don't. We divide different. We do things a little differently, okay? Prokaryotics, they lack that membrane-bound nucleus. Their division is a hell of a lot different, okay? The copying of their genetic material is a heck of a lot different than ours. Super easy, super complex. It's very basic. There's not much to it though, okay? Archaic live in extreme environments. These are basically the environments that mimic primitive Earth, okay? Living at the bottom of the ocean, living in a volcanic area, in a volcano, in a volcanic vent at the bottom of the ocean, all right? Very extreme environments that these things live and thrive in. Ironically, though, these are pretty, there's a lot of commonality between archaea and eukaryotic organisms. You know, I think we have more in common with this than bacteria, okay? The great thing about bacteria, they don't necessarily live in extreme environments. They live pretty much in everything, not just an extreme environment, but you don't see a lot of necessarily bacteria in a lot of extreme environments, like at the bottom of the ocean and stuff like that, because that's for these dudes up here. But we have bacteria all over us. We have bacteria on our skin, okay? It helps to kind of keep foreign invaders at bay, keeps things from growing on the surface of our skin. We have bacteria in our stomach, okay? They release chemicals. Those chemicals help to tell us that we're full. We have bacteria that live in our large intestine, and those you probably have heard of, okay? The microflora, the microbiome, okay? And they obviously help us out a lot. And they've done a buttload of research on those bacteria, on all the bacteria inside of us they have. But those down there in the large intestine, those bacteria are awesome. They help you to handle carbohydrates. They help to create certain vitamins. They help to, prevent foreign invaders from gaining a foothold in there, all right? And the great thing about it is if you were born naturally, vaginal birth, and if you were breastfed, you have different microbiome than somebody who didn't have both of those. What if you say your mom just had a C-section and breastfed you? Well, at least you got something, okay? That breast milk causes the formation of certain types of bacteria that live in that large intestine. And they've discovered that your microbiome is different between breastfed and non-breastfed babies. And the ones that were breastfed, they have a different bacteria and they're able to handle carbohydrates a little bit better, process them better, so they don't get converted to fat as easily, I guess. They do a ton of research on these things. I know that they started doing research on some of the hunter-gatherer tribes in Africa, comparing their microbiome with those of various different cultures around the world to kind of see what differences diet makes to the microbiome and how that can cause a certain type of bacteria to grow within there and to be dominant, and what that means for our health. So there's a lot of interesting things that go on with all of these domains. Here's just some examples here. I'm not going to ask you to give me an example of archaea. I just ain't, all right? But here's some fabulous pictures to kind of show you these basic kind of rudimentary structures. Here we got E. coli, okay? A lot of different shapes for these guys. And we'll look at those later on when we talk about the plasma membrane and the shape of cells. Eukaryotic domain has a number of subdivisions called kingdoms. fungi, plantae, animalia. You know, I mean, you've heard of these two, and we'll be looking at these two. Okay, we'll be talking about photosynthesis. We'll be talking about metabolism. Okay, and we'll be talking about, you know, the cellular structure of these two guys here. So we're going to focus mainly our class on these two kingdoms within the domain eukaryotic. We have Protista. They are very, very basic. Okay, if you look at that cell there, if you look at this organism here and compare that to this organism here, you can obviously see that there's a hell of a lot more complexity, right? There's a number of kingdoms associated with Protista, so that's why you don't see the word kingdom in front of Protista there. Okay, because there are a vast number of kingdoms within it. Okay, so 3 domains, and then the kingdoms. Okay, okay, and all the kingdoms that you need to worry about are in the eukaryotic organisms, us, because that's really what this class is centered on and focuses in on. If you have an older textbook from maybe a handful of years ago, you don't see all of these different various kingdoms here within the domain eukaryotic. This is something relatively new. Gives scientists who are bored something to do, I guess. Genus is always capitalized, species is always lowercase. When done so, it's written in italics or it's underlined if you're writing it out. That's all you need to know here. I'm not going to get into a lot of nomenclature. Any questions here, guys, before we move on?